Hello, everyone. This is a great pleasure and very exciting to welcome all of you today. We have more than 700 registrants from all over the world. Actually, I wish I could see you all, and maybe we should actually post a selfie on Twitter with the hashtag so we can all see each other. But that's just wonderful to be coming together today. Wings is celebrating 20 years, and for those who are not familiar with Wings, we are a global network of philanthropy development and philanthropy support organizations who are committed to ensuring that philanthropy reaches its fullest potential in bringing about social change. And I believe that in the current situation that we're in, we need to come together as a field at the global level as never before. And while multilateralism is stumbling, philanthropy cannot do the same and turn its back on its challenges. The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that there is not a single challenge that is only local or national or even regional. And so we need that global coordination also for philanthropic actors. And we need to build it intentionally. We need to invest in it. It's not going to happen alone. Really call on all of you to engage with us to accelerate the pace of social change. The WINGSForum is a very special event to our global community of change makers and philanthropy developers. It is actually how everything started for Wings, because the founding act of Wings was actually the first international meeting of associations of grant makers in Oaxaca in Mexico back in 1998. And we were established as a permanent network in 2000. And until today, that event, this WINGSForum, remains really a very unique opportunity for the field to come together in all its diversity and to engage in meaningful debates, to cross-fertilize, to have honest discussions and sometimes challenging discussions as the one that I think we're going to have today. And today we should all have been in Nairobi in Kenya, actually for the first time on the African continent for WINGSForum, with our co-host, our friends at the Africa Philanthropy Network. And I'd like us to harness the theme of this virtual summit and imagine for a second that we are all right now in Nairobi, in Kenya. And I really, really hope that next year we'll be able to come together in person and continue all these important discussions and debates we're going to start today. But the fact that we're in this virtual space actually provides us a wonderful opportunity to make our discussions accessible broadly and to all. And actually, we're really very, very excited to welcome a great number of new friends. And I'd like to welcome all of you who are joining a Wings event for the first time. Thanks for joining us. So this is really an exceptionally special day for us because of having all of you joining us here. Of course, because of this fantastic lineup of speakers that we have. We will celebrate the Wings 20th anniversary. And we have actually a surprise. That surprise will give you actually an exclusive preview on the new brand of Wings, the new identity of Wings that we'll unveil in just a few days. So when we defined the theme, Imagine, we didn't expect that suddenly the need to rethink our field and the way we work would become even more pressing, and that the three levers that we've defined as our sub-themes of power, technology, and new economy would become even more central in thinking change in this new normal or this new abnormal, which has exacerbated power disparities. And I was just reading actually an article right now, right before this, we're opening this event, that was informing us that the 500 richest people in the world have seen their assets increasing by 23% in this year of pandemic, while we know that we should expect about 100 million people to be thrown into extreme poverty globally. Technology, I don't need to remind you, and we're all here in this virtual space, that in this new context, in this new normal, digitalization is revolutionizing the way we live, the way we work, and economy, because the global economy needs to rethink itself deeply and quickly. So more than ever, we need to embrace all the opportunities that they present and also tackle courageously the challenges that they bring to our disrupted world. So to guide us through this journey, we're very, very honored to count on Maurice Makolo, who is the Ford Foundation's Regional Director for East Africa, the WINGS Chair, and above all, a very inspiring leader, change maker, and human being. So Maurice, the floor is yours, and I wish you all a fantastic event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone from wherever you are. It is my singular pleasure on behalf of the WINGSForum 2020 Planning Committee, and indeed to just, as an African, somebody in Nairobi, to welcome you to our conversation today. In Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, we encounter an old man, Ogbuefi Uchendu, who says, when we gather in a moonlit village, it is not the moon that brings us together, for each one of us can see it from his own compound. But we do so because it is good for kinsmen to be together. Indeed, all of us, as Benjamin has said, we come from different and unique perspectives of work on philanthropy, from academy to field practice, from philanthropic support to, imagining and reimagining many other ways of doing things. WINGSForum is our space and place to gather around the moonlit village. And we do so every 3 years so that it is a forum to challenge, to experience, to inspire, to teach, to learn. And nothing could be special than the WINGSForum 2020/21. That's very unique. As Benjamin has said, it is going to be the first time that we are coming together in Nairobi, in Africa. The fact that it was supposed to have been in Nairobi 2020, but now we are hoping to have the in-person one 2021, number one, signals a new beginning. And that is why we are also even very excited about the possibility of hosting all of you in Nairobi. And therefore, it also dovetails into our theme, imagine, because we are going to be imagining a new beginning. As we think about the moment now, 20 years later, from the time that WINGS started, there is a lot of new. This very fact of how much new has come up lately is possibly evidence of just how much room there still is for more new. And all we have to imagine is what more can be new and what we can do with whatever new that we think about. New ways of telling stories, new meanings of those stories, and everything else that is associated with it. And that is why today it gives me singular pleasure as we celebrate our 20 years of existence to take us off on a journey of imagining new power, or power as it has existed or it could exist, and its relationship with philanthropy, and with the fantastic speakers that we are going to have. But before then, how about a starter? And our starter is a short film, and I want to just thank our producers, the makers of this film, the Mattel line, for the excellent work that they have done in just introducing you to WINGS and WINGS work. This film has the people you see, everyone you see there, is either a member or a partner of our global network. And indeed, we will have, and we do have some other films and videos that we are going to be able to share in a little while. As you have also seen, and heard from Benjamin, we are going to see new things, talking about new logo, new images on this particular film. And so let me just pause here as we enjoy the starter. See you in a bit. Thank you, and most welcome once again.
Philanthropy is not new, and it's not just about the wealthy giving money to those less fortunate.
En fait, la philanthropie, ce n'est peut-être pas du tout une question d'argent.
The philanthropic instinct has existed since the dawn of human history.
Generosity is the foundation of all human progress and connection. Without it, we simply cannot hope to have the thriving societies we wish for.
But turning that hope into reality requires that we grow, harness, and channel all of our philanthropic work into something more.
Inspiring people, organizations, and institutions to work together towards a common purpose is our greatest opportunity.
But it's also our greatest challenge because there are so many political, economic, cultural, even philosophical obstacles to overcome.
But they can and must be overcome.
Helping philanthropy reach its fullest potential as a catalyst for change requires a new kind of leadership.
Driven by humility.
Leadership with a hunger to know the right questions rather than pretend to know all the answers.
A willingness to challenge the status quo and the courage to speak the truth.
To solve problems with all stakeholders of a community, not for them.
حان وقت الاستثمار لبناء نظم وأسس لدعم العطاء الاجتماعي من أجل ازدهاره.
It is time to make sure people, governments, and institutions embrace philanthropy as a way to create real change.
And we must be determined.
Because change will not come easily.
We must reimagine our relationship with each other, with the governments, and with the earth.
E ridefinire che cosa intendiamo per progresso.
We must reconstruct the power dynamics that have defined human history for centuries.
We must recommit to basic human rights, privacy, cultural identity, and self-determination.
We're at a turning point in human history. The question is, in which direction will humankind turn?
是时候让慈善行业的所有的利益相关方都走在一起，共同努力实现社会目标。
To face uncomfortable truths and to challenge the status quo.
To be self-critical, humble, and open to exploring new ways.
To learn from each other and inspire.
To advocate. Make no mistake, we are at a turning point in human history.
Membros da comunidade da Wings estão trabalhando para garantir um futuro mais justo, saudável e igual para todos nós.
It is time for all of us to come together to elevate philanthropy around the world. Join us.
And now, sisters and brothers, please extend your hand to a glass or a cup and join us. All right. So as you heard, we are celebrating 20 years. And I want to invite all of you, panelists, speakers, everyone, wherever you are, to raise your glass or cup, whatever you have, to celebrate this huge milestone that we have. To Wings. Thank you so much. Now, if that was a starter, I'm not sure what to call the next segment because we have some two fantastic human beings, colleagues. My sister, NAILA FAROUKY, the CEO of the Arab Foundations Forum. You know, NAILA is also the chair of the Wings board. And boy and girl, if you have not seen NAILA commanding a room and generating consensus, just watch and you will know what I'm talking about. She brings deep experience working from the Arab world and connecting it to other geographic locations, but also her own self, her own personal history into this conversation. She's going to be joined by my senior brother and mentor, Akwasi, in his own unique poetic way. Akwasi, who is a senior brother, we've worked the same location called the Ford Foundation. He preceded me, and a fountain under whose source I have drunk numerously and severally. And I just want you to appreciate these wonderful two people as they join us this afternoon, beginning with NAILA and followed by Akwasi to kickstart our conversation. Over to you, NAILA, and you will be followed immediately by Akwasi. Most welcome.
Thank you, Morris. Hello, everyone. So on behalf of the WINGS Board of Directors, it's my pleasure to welcome you all here today, albeit virtually, as we kick off our first of many sessions in our reimagined WINGSForum, ushering the new normal, brought to you by COVID-19. So the theme of our forum this year is Imagine. And with that in mind, I've been trying to think about saying a few words that speak to this theme without speaking in platitudes and without seeming to be neither over nor under optimistic, which given the reality of the world today is a difficult task to say the least. But I've been reflecting on the state of the world, as I assume we all have, and I've tried to put into brief points some thoughts that have occurred to me during this contemplation about our sector and where we stand vis-a-vis the theme of Imagine. So to be brief, here's what I've come up with. The first is to imagine the way forward. I read an article last night in the Washington Post where the writer gave the advice that we should all abandon this mindset of pausing until normal life can resume and to simply accept the fact that we're already in it. This is the normal for now. And this got me thinking about how willing I am and maybe how necessary it is for me to actually abandon the mindset of when we can resume life, but really how we can resume it given all the givens. In our work, a lot has changed. And I know that for me personally, it's the first time in over a decade that I stay put without travel for longer than 6 weeks at a time. And what this has done for me is that it's allowed me a moment to contemplate the things I wasn't ever able to do before because I simply didn't have the time to do that. Things like strategy and purpose and long-term planning. And even though I haven't quite come up with all of the answers, I've enjoyed the possibility to even begin thinking about those things. And so I say we can at least begin by imagining our way forward and what we want and what we need it to look like. The second is about imagining what needs to change. And if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that undoubtedly something needs to change. And I think that something is different for each person, for each community, for each organization, but the fact remains that we need to adapt. For me, I know, for instance, that I will never travel as frequently as I used to again. And I don't mean that lightly. Truly, I think that the magic or the curse of Zoom and other platforms has shown us that a good portion of the many meetings we jet off to can be held more efficiently and more effectively without reducing our productivity, but certainly by reducing our carbon footprint and preserving some of our energy to be put towards some other things that matter as well. So at the end of the day, in our sector, the sector that encompasses civil society, development, philanthropy, it behooves us to consider how we might be able to make meaningful impact more efficiently. And at least that's how I intend to approach it. And of course, the value of in-person, face-to-face meetings can't be fully replaced in a digital, virtual world, but we might take this opportunity to mindfully consider when the effort outweighs the value and vice versa. And then finally, imagine how to affect the change that needs to be made. You know, we talk a lot about collaboration, cooperation, knowledge sharing, and partnership in our fields of work. But we don't always live up to achieving these valuable assets. And this is for a number of reasons. But here's where the value of this event that brings us here together today can be felt and realized. WINGS is a vast and an ever-growing gathering of grant makers, associations, networks, and other philanthropy actors from around the globe. We have over 150 members from over 50 countries around the world. And as we contemplate a foreseeable future where making physical connections may be hindered, we're at least afforded this opportunity to leverage this network to maintain our virtual connections at a time when we might actually need them the most. We know that the path ahead for the sector globally will be challenging, regardless of where we live or where we work. There's this collective challenge ahead, and there's something perhaps a little comforting in knowing that we're all in this together. So if we can imagine the ways in which we can reach out to our global network of peers, if we can establish and create these partnerships and collaborations with our colleagues and our friends around the world, if we can share our experiences of what works and what doesn't work, we may actually be able to succeed in not only adapting to, but in fact creating a new and maybe an even better normal. So these are the overarching questions and considerations I have running through my mind as we launch day one of the WINGSForum 2020 online. A reimagined forum, adapted to cope with an unimagined reality, and one that I hope will be an experience that you will all find worthwhile and at least thought-provoking. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Akwasi Edu, and I'm glad to be here. I'll make a few very brief points. The first point I want to make is that we need to imagine the relationships between us as philanthropic institutions and professionals and the grantees, sometimes called partners, because charity begins at home. If we're going to change the world, we must change our internal relationships. And part of it has to do with sustainability. And I want to give you a quote that you may have already heard or seen from a letter that the Austrian-Hungarian Jewish theologian, philosopher, Friedrich von Hegel wrote to his niece centuries ago. He said, "The golden rule is to help those we love to escape from us." The golden rule is to help those we love to escape from us. And so one of the things we've got to constantly highlight as philanthropists or philanthropy professionals, institutions, is how we can get beyond what I call the syndrome of projectitis, where it's all about projects. You finish, you give us your report, and we move on. And you're one grant away from extinction. We've got to imagine how that can end. And I have a poem that I wrote a few days ago when I was asked to join this. I quickly wrote it, so it's not perfect, but I'll read it out to you. It's a 5-stanza haiku poem titled, "Imagine They Plead." Imagine they plead. Here is the poem. Imagine they plead, grantees as equalities, not as recipients, nor as dependents trussed up loads for life and death, but as space sharers. Imagine them right as bestowers of knowledge, philanthropic-wise, moving on their own with you as accompaniers to the bright future. Then no power game, but a flat field belonging to all who work it. Imagination for generations, christened sustainanthropy. Imagine, they plead. Thank you very much. Stayed within the time limit. Over to you.
Thank you so much, NAILA. Thank you so much, Akwasi. I hope you envy me because every month, Akwasi sends me and a few others a poem for the month with such new things as structure, context, texture. My goodness, this guy. And thank you so much, NAILA, for just sharing that. I now want to hand over the baton to my sister from another mother, Jessica Horn. Before I do, I just want to say two things about Jessica, who, like Akwasi, is a poet and a writer. And I start with those two things to say, I have read a little about Jessica, and one of the things that immediately struck me is her courage. And I want to salute her courage because, as Maya Angelou says, courage is the one virtue that really is important, because without it, one can never practice any other virtues consistently. It takes courage to write, to express yourself so publicly, knowing that, not even knowing how that is going to be received. It takes courage. The second point, as I hand over the baton to Jessica, is to just remind you of her own multiple experiences with power. As a grant maker, as a writer, the power of her pen, as a civil society actor, all these are multiple experiences of power. And so what a blessing indeed to have her moderate our conversation this afternoon. Over to you, Jessica.
For introduction, Wewale, asante sana. And to everybody who has opened the space up. We've been offered moonlight. We've been offered, the idea of sustainanthropy. We've been offered the space to imagine, and the idea that the work is about with and not for. And so I feel like that's a perfect way of framing what we're about to do in this conversation, which is to really delve into the juicy questions of how philanthropy relates to power. And of course, it's an important historical moment to do this in, because it is a moment of upheaval and reflection, and a moment when we're really thinking about power, not just in the sense of the people that rule us, but also in the sense of how we come together to defend each other's lives, right? And to actually create the possibility of resistance, resilience, and survival. And we're doing that, of course, facing all of the multiple isms, the structural racisms and sexisms and homophobias and what have yous, climate catastrophe, and of course, a life-threatening global pandemic, which has sort of brought us all back to the reality that we actually do have a shared humanity and we need to think about it quite seriously. So, philanthropy is embroiled in all of this, because in philanthropy, we do this work of investing. Right, we invest in ideas, in people, in communities that we hope will work to transform these power relations, right, and transform them for the better. And these power relations themselves, though, are also shifting, and it's no longer just, our attention isn't just about vertical power, but thinking about horizontal power, about movements, about crowdsourcing ideas and information and funding, right? But we're also increasingly thinking about, or being forced to think about, these power relations amongst ourselves. And as Akwasi was talking about, this question of really understanding the relationships that we form in philanthropy, and how we manage those in the interest of a liberatory kind of power. So, this is a really juicy conversation, and an absolute pleasure that with us in this conversation are people who have really explored this with a full heart from all global regions. We have on the panel people with experience from the Middle East, from Asia, from the African region, from the Americas and Europe, to explore this question together. Just a quick note about methodology before I go into the introductions, and then we get into the meat of it all. So each person is going to speak very briefly to just present sort of like some of their big ideas and thoughts, so we can hear them, in a condensed way. And then we're going to get into a dialogue amongst ourselves, and then we're going to turn it over to some of your questions. So you'll see a Q&A chat if you're on Zoom. At the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to ask your questions there. I see people are already commenting there. And also, if you're listening and you'd rather do so on Twitter, @wings_info is the Wings Twitter address. The hashtag is WINGSForum 2020. And if you put your questions there, we'll also be trying to look at some of the questions from Twitter, and we'll look at our Twitter at the end as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the speakers, and this is the order that they will be doing their initial introductions. So first is Ambika Satkunanathan. She's a chairperson of a Sri Lankan grant-making organization called the Nilan Tiruchelvam Trust, and also vice chair of Urgent Action Fund Asia and Pacific, which is a regional feminist grant maker. It's also a rapid response grant maker, and she's an Open Society fellow. After that, we'll be hearing from Mukhtar Kochach. He's the founder of RAWA, which is the Creative Palestinian Communities Fund. But he's spent, 25 years or so in this field of both philanthropy and social and cultural change, really thinking about ways that we do the work differently. And almost a decade of that was at the Ford Foundation in Cairo. Then we'll be welcoming VIDYA SHAH. She's the chairperson and CEO of Edelive Foundation, which is a philanthropic initiative of the Edelweiss Group. And that's one of India's leading diversified financial services groups. So she's got experience again of that enormous country of India, the world's largest democracy, they call it, and philanthropy, that's exciting philanthropy that's happening there. And then lastly, Henry Timms. Henry Timms is the co-founder of Giving Tuesday, and he's also the current president and CEO of the Lincoln Center in New York. And he is co-author of the international best-selling book, New Power, which looks at a lot of these questions that we're talking about today, about how power in the world is shifting to a more horizontal, communitarian, collectivist expression. So I'm sure you will join me in under the moonlight in your virtual spaces to have a warm welcome to all of my panelists here. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Ambika.
Thank you, Jessica, for the wonderful introduction. So without further ado, I too will just kind of jump in and talk maybe a little bit about the trust, and through that, the issues that we are confronting today. So where is the Nilan Tiruchelvam Trust placed within this ecosystem? Our existence itself is a bit of a paradox, which I think is reflective of the ecosystem that we philanthropic institutions inhabit. The trust's existence illustrates that we too are part of the hierarchical top-down privileged power structure, but our work these 20 years has shown that we have been able to leverage it to address structural change and support interventions that challenge unequal, inequitable power structures. So how are we part of the privileged power structure? Well, the trust was established to continue the work of a well-known constitutional scholar and human rights advocate. Hence, it wasn't initially difficult for us to source financial resources to establish the trust. So we are well aware of our privilege and ensure that equality forms the foundation and core of our work and interactions. So how have we leveraged our privilege to challenge unequal and authoritarian power? I feel our existence itself in the context of internal armed conflict, which raged for much of the life of the trust, and thereafter a repressive regime where civil society was subject to intimidation, threats, and harassment, or worse, has been a challenge to authoritarian or repressive power centers and structures. Even if we do not challenge these power structures, they view our existence and work itself as a challenge. We invest in work that others have been afraid or reluctant to support, such as initiatives on the social reintegration of former combatants or legal aid for those arbitrarily detained or survivors of violence. In a deeply divided society like Sri Lanka, we have managed, with a lot of conscious and careful decision-making, to support all ethno-religious communities, because we are aware that in deeply divided societies, aid or philanthropy can also worsen existing ethno-religious cleavages. So where does the trust's power lie? Our power lies in our staying power. Because we're local, we cannot go anywhere. We cannot leave the country when things become difficult or when repressive laws are enacted to control the activities of civil society organizations. We will remain with our communities. We take risks. We seek and invest in community organizations that are doing impactful work, but do not have the knowledge to navigate the sometimes complex world of grants and donors and project proposals. Our power also lies in being able to provide long-term support for a few years, not just 6 months or 1 year, but long-term to small community organizations so that they're able to consolidate their work and find their feet. We see ourselves as more than just a grant maker because we provide institutional support. For instance, we help institutions establish their financial systems and processes by bringing on board specialists, such as accounting firms that provide pro bono training. We try to erode the power of the gatekeepers by helping small community organizations access space to have their voices heard in the public sphere, to policymakers, to the international community. We also strongly believe that change is internally driven, and we are guided by the communities as to the kind of work they need support for. So we're not prescriptive. I would like to end by quoting from a report of the Foundations for Peace Network, a network of indigenous grant makers, of which the trust is a member. The evidence suggests that such transformation has to come from within. Unless local people own and develop the change themselves, it will fail to take root. A key role for external funders and agencies is to support local efforts to build social justice and peace. Indigenous forces for change make for lasting peace, and no amount of external intervention on its own can deliver this. Thank you.
Meeting on Zoom, but anyway, we're going to do the universal deaf sign for clapping, right? Since, yeah, we now have more languages available to us. Brilliant, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn over to Mukhtar now.
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks, everyone. It's great to be in an environment where we could hear the chickens behind Benjamin, and the fact that I could also be in my pajamas, waist down, and my slippers. And I guess, I echo what I've heard about the intimacy and the personal dynamics that have allowed us to have a deeper dive into a soul-searching moment over the last 8 months. I humbly represent so many people who have been involved for a long period of time in a critical analysis of issues of wealth, privilege, and how they relate to colonialism and exploitation and self-determination. I have been involved in grant making for over 15 years, 20 years, damn. And over the last 5 years, I've been involved in probably the most exciting activity of my life. We're a group of 50 people who over the last 3 years have worked together to develop a participatory grant-making fund located in Palestine. The fund is called RAWA. RAWA means to quench a thirst and to tell a story, Creative Palestinian Communities Fund. Most people are volunteers. There's a small team of 6 folks who are part-time, and the anchors of the entire structure sits with community grant makers who come from all sorts of disciplines and backgrounds and are located throughout historic Palestine. Many of the people involved have spent decades in the philanthropy world and the development world and are now redeeming their sins by joining a labor of love and solidarity and creativity. So I just wanted to acknowledge that community of incredible people, complicated but extremely necessary. Why in Palestine, the context is extremely important. And you know, Palestine is a microcosm in a sense of all sorts of complications and systems meltdown at the global level. And if any of you still think that we are not experiencing a global governance meltdown, you just need to take a look at some of our leadership around us and how they got into power and the decision making and the ethical barometers that they embody, just to sort of let it sink in that this is the time to actually restructure and move forward. A population of people who for decades have been stripped away completely from any decision-making power. Decision-making power at all levels. And so that's why in that particular environment, it is extremely important to generate modes of participation and self-determination. The Palestinian society has been embattled and sterilized through external philanthropic and development aid support. Perhaps the largest per capita recipients of donor aid over the last 30 years, yet a constant degradation of social, political, economic, and cultural rights. So you need to think, so it makes you think like, so what is the problem? Clearly, the mechanisms are not working. All of this funding has stripped away the agency of people and turned them into recipients. It has moved individual leaders from their communities and turned them into professionalized NGO workers. There has been a trauma and a colonization of spirit, of mind, and of language that has been imposed on communities throughout the global South, but not only in the global South, through our philanthropic activity and the development aid that accompanies it. So nothing about us without us was coined by the disabilities rights movement, and this seems to me as a bedrock of all of the work that we should be involved in moving forward. Of course, the feminist movement has been a precursor over many decades in imagining and creating and building structures that are alternative and that are more horizontal and participatory in scope. And we at RAWA are rooted in those values and beliefs. What's amazing is that the process of grant making by communities themselves who have never had the possibility of making decisions is on itself a process and an objective and a goal that we are trying to seek. Civic engagement is not something that you workshop people to death. Civic engagement is practiced. It is embodied. It has to be performed. And so, I think it's really important for us as we imagine systems moving forward that these systems enable and provide people with the opportunities to liberate themselves rather than be recipients of charity or the dictates of folks who are from outside of their own context. I'll stop here and then we'll look forward to more later on.
Structural environment, as you say, is so disempowering when people actually don't have the self-determination to make a decision, and the power that philanthropy brings if it actually enables that deep participation. Thank you. So next we'll turn to Vidya.
Thanks, Jessica. I'll just start by saying a little about Edelive and then setting the context for philanthropy in India and the history and its evolution in a sense. So I am from Edelive Foundation. We're based in Mumbai and we're an India-centric grant making and capacity building organization. We're about 12 years old. And as you said in the introduction, it's actually a corporate foundation. And the corporate is a financial services group that my husband and another friend and I set up about 25 years ago. And the reason we set up the foundation so early on, we were about 7 or 8 years old when we set up the foundation, was because we had a deep sense of gratitude for being in the right place at the right time. India took off in the 90s with its reforms process. We had the benefit of great education and there we were, and we wanted to really start giving early rather than later. And that's how the whole foundation was born. I was CFO for some time, and then I took on the mantle of leading the foundation. And our approach was very much from the for-profit side of things. So when we first started looking at grants to make and organizations to fund, we realized that while funding is always, a challenge in India, it's also a challenge of capacity, and especially for small and medium-sized organizations that have this incredible strength of being rooted in communities with a deep understanding of the issues that they face and therefore the solutioning around it. The issue of growth, scale, evolution, modification, adaptation is a deeper issue, and therefore we really built the foundation to do both: fund, but we also work very closely to identify gaps in capacity and work to either provide them or to fund the provision of it. And that's been our evolution. But I think as I got deeper into this, and I had no understanding of development when I started in 2007. But I think as we went deeper and deeper into it, I think I realized why it was that there was this kind of gap in communication between funding organizations and the sector. And if you see the history of philanthropy or even development funding in the country, post-independence, we were really flooded with international aid, and the bilats and the multilats were really very, very prominent right until the 80s. And it was only really post the 80s, just barring a few large trusts, private trusts like the Tata Trust, which almost everybody around the world knows, there was very little incidence of, if I can call it, professional foundations or private or personal philanthropy. And the only other international organizations which made a deep impact on civil society and built some of the greatest institutions that we have today are organizations like the Ford Foundation, who came to India at the invitation of Jawaharlal Nehru, our first Prime Minister, in the 60s. So I think the culture was deeply West-oriented, which I want to say in the most respectful way. It was also very international. It was not homegrown. It was extremely well-meaning, but it did not really take into account the realities of the politics of the country at that time. We had prime ministers that followed Mr. Nehru, who were deeply nationalistic, who believed that we needed to find our own solutions. And we went through a wave of nationalization of institutions and so on and so forth. I think post-90s, when we saw the reforms process evolve, and we saw for the first time private wealth actually created before our very eyes, that we started seeing the incidence of personal philanthropy. And I think over the last 10 years in particular, some of the largest wealth creators, especially in the field of technology, have really been at the forefront of giving, and giving in large sums. Along with that, there has been another change, which is the incidence of mandatory CSR by corporates which cross a certain threshold of profit. And that's brought its own dynamic, because CSR necessarily is short-term, because budgets get decided on an annual basis. So this whole potpourri, or this whole collection of very different approaches, the international aid approach, the large international foundation approach, the personal philanthropy approach, and then a corporate approach to philanthropy, or giving in a sense, has created a lot of confusion and has led to a lot of organizations on the ground struggling to cope. We've also seen over the last few years international aid reducing drastically. Many private international bilats have actually left the country because they now believe India should be able to fund its own problems. So therefore, this is a time of churning. This is a time of adjustment. And this is a time, and COVID has made all of these challenges even more acute. And just to sort of wrap up from the approach of Edelive, I think our approach has been that we need to work with strong community-based organizations. We need to fund them. But increasingly, as we look at the edgier issues, which are issues of violence, issues of gender justice, issues of building grassroots leadership, particularly of women and girls, we need Indian philanthropy to really come up and match that need, and not constantly depend on large foreign foundations who understand these issues, are very well-meaning, bring the money. But unless Indians are also prepared to fund the issues of the country, we will always lag behind. And one of our missions at Edelive as an ecosystem player, we're not just a funder, we bring other funders together, is to really bring that realization and increase the amount of funding that needs to go to the more pressing issues in the country. Thanks, Jessica.
Of philanthropy in India, but also your role in field building, because of course that is one power that institutional philanthropy can play, is to actually help build a field. And in that case, it's a field of national philanthropic giving, which is really exciting. So lastly, we're going to turn to Henry.
Hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be part of this community today, and especially to celebrate the anniversary and achievement of the WINGS community around the world. My work in this space has been in theory and in practice. So in theory, I've been thinking about how we classify power. So with my colleague Jeremy Hymans, we've written and thought about the idea of all of these trends we all recognize, right? We can see the through lines. How could we create a taxonomy for those trends that makes them more useful and more comprehensible for practitioners? So we put on this frame of thinking about the difference between old power and new power. So old power, top down, very much kind of command and control, typically quite leader driven, about kind of the individual who spends down often his power on his terms. And the difference between that and new power, which is the power which is uploaded, it's made by many, it's much more open, it's much more about what you share, it's much less about the kind of typical leader paradigm that we have all got used to. So in the past years, we've been thinking and writing about the difference between old power and new power and what it means for the world. And as a practitioner, I've been honored to be part of a community of people around the world, many of whom are represented on this call, building Giving Tuesday. So Giving Tuesday was designed from the beginning to be essentially a new power experiment. So for those who don't know Giving Tuesday yet, it's a global day of philanthropy, celebrating the generosity, which is very much the DNA of the Wings community. We celebrated this year on December the 1st and is now in 75 countries around the world. And what was interesting about the experiment, and it was an experiment with Giving Tuesday, was we were from the start thinking about how power is shifting differently. So that was a project that we designed to be co-owned by people around the world. And in fact, many members of the Wings community in different places around the world came forward and said, hey, I like this idea of Giving Tuesday. I'd like to take it to my own area of the world and make it relevant and make it engaged there. So it was designed as something that really wasn't about a centralized leadership structure and wasn't about having a kind of headquarters and a general secretary and local chapters in the old power way, but actually designed as an experiment about not just sharing generosity, but sharing power, about creating a movement that actually allows people wherever they are to come to the movement in their own terms and engage in something that shares values but doesn't share rules, right? And that's been a very interesting experiment over the last 9 years now. And I guess I just wanted to kind of share a couple of things that I've learned from the Giving Tuesday community, which is just so many dynamic leaders around the world, all of whom are on a WhatsApp group together every day. So I know many of them will be tuning in. And one of the things I think I've learned about this kind of work is number one, if we're thinking about power and philanthropy, the kind of people who make new power leaders successful are not typically the people who are good at old power leadership, right? So if you think about the philanthropy world, we often have tended to reward single individuals whose dynamic personal narratives transform the space because of their epiphany moment where they've seen epiphany, and they, by transporting themselves to the center of someone else's problem, find ways of solving it, right? That has been the way we have kind of, it's a stereotype, but it's one which I see some nodding heads for a reason. We have set up the idea of kind of the superhero, the superstar, old power leader. The reason Giving Tuesday, I think, has caught on and has proved as successful as it has is not because it's led by superstars, but it's led by superconductors. It's led by those leaders who actually are always capable of not making it about them and their centrality and their agency, but actually feeding the agency of a broader community, of a broader ecosystem. And one of the things I think which is so interesting about that movement, the CEO, Asha Curran, who runs it, one of the great achievements I think of that work is actually the leadership demand, which is how do you scale culture, right? How do you actually, in a world without rules, where you can't control things in old power ways, how do you think about developing a global culture where everyone can share something, even if they don't share languages, even if they don't share politics, even if they don't share worldviews? How do you think about that? I think that's a really important lesson for all of us. Two more conclusions, I think, from kind of the Giving Tuesday experiment. One, I think when it's all very trendy now to talk about power, right? Which is good in many ways. It's an important conversation, but often the people you hear talking about empowering people are prepared to give up nothing, right? It's very easy to talk about empowerment, very hard to talk about actually spending down your power, right? So just as foundations are getting good now at spending down endowments, how do they think about spending down their power? I think is a very important question we ought to pose. And then finally, on a note of optimism, very much in line with the terrific poem that we started our day with today, I think we are at a point between two worlds right now, right? If you think about the old power world, it's very obvious the failings of the old power world in philanthropy are obvious, right? They've been brought into clear relief. There is much discussion on the failings, the weaknesses, the disparities, the inequalities of old power philanthropy. And yet we are still moving into this world of new power philanthropy, right? We are, all of us, every speaker so far today has talked about the struggles we are facing in how do we shift to a world where we create structures in a new power way that are impactful and fair and equitable. And that work is beginning. So as we look to the next 20 years of the WINGSForum, one hope, one thing I would certainly toast is the optimism we should all have in the great opportunity of new power, which is if leaders like those on this call today do the work that they do for the years ahead, we will end up in a world where new power truly makes more people more powerful. And I think that's my great hope with this work, is that you end up where power truly is. We've distributed participation, we also want to distribute power. It's such an honor to be with you today.
The company of such metaphor-rich speakers is just the absolute pleasure. I love that idea of being superconductors rather than fetishizing superstars. So, I mean, we want to have a conversation now. All of you guys have put so many juicy ideas and models and thinking on the table, and also just the excitement of the fact that you're actually in the middle of doing it, you know, and so it's not just theory, you know, it's actually things that you are experimenting with and looking to practice. And I want to kind of pick up on the energy that Henry left us on, which is this question of the participatory and of the decentralized, you know? And so to think a little bit about that, I mean, the idea of participatory in the institutional philanthropy world is really gathering pace. And there are a lot of funders, even large institutional funders, who are looking at experiments in participation, or even, you know, doing funding models that are coming up around participatory approaches. And of course, you know, it's tremendously exciting, but we are still in that limbo space of sort of getting used to the new and kind of not really relinquishing the old. We also know that participation is not without its challenges, because human beings aren't neutral. And so while we assume that people might prioritize the good, we also have to take into account that people are also biased. And sometimes in democratic process, people decide that they're not going to prioritize minorities, for example, of different kinds in some way, or they're not going to prioritize women's rights or what have you. So I'm actually interested to hear from each of you to begin, what you see as the broader potential and challenges of this idea of fully decentralizing, fully shifting power, fully engaging in this sort of deeply participatory approach to philanthropy. And I don't know if anybody is burning to start yet. If not, I will call names. Mukhtar, you're smiling. I'm going to call on you first.
Oh, damn it. Okay, now I know not to smile, so I won't be called on. Listen, I mean, I think, you know, I don't want to scare many of the folks here who are in traditional philanthropies and are wondering what the heck to do during this moment of intensity. It doesn't, you know, we're not talking about, you know, total participation at all levels. We're not talking about letting go of all decision-making power. We're just saying, let's put the mechanisms in place, not only because they are ethical, but because actually they are more productive. You know, I mean, for those of us who have been in this field for so long, do we really have the data and the argumentation to show that traditional philanthropy has actually accomplished what it was meant to do? No. And yet we spend millions of dollars on review processes, reporting, external evaluation. We restructure every 5 years. Every time there's a director, and it's usually men who come along, they wanna bring in their new DNA or their new great ideas. It is not about the foundations. It is about the communities and the broader good. And there is a disjuncture in the way this field is structured. The issues are not technical in nature. We know how to solve these issues. There are clearly enough smart people globally working on these issues to figure out how to create mechanisms of accountability and transparency and oversight and efficiency. We know how to do that. The issue is political will. And the issues in general are political in nature. And I want us to sort of think about two fundamental issues that are, an ultimate contradiction to the sector. One is this total amnesia that exists about where the wealth was created. And so I think we can start there. It would be helpful. It would be, a good place of reparation, of understanding the complexity of the power that currently resides within the philanthropic sector. How was this wealth created? What damage did it create? Can we repair it? Can we minimize it? Can we at least address it, for God's sake? Second, the big elephant in the room, and every time some of us have tried to address it, we get slapped on the hand, is our investments. Our investment portfolios do not embody the values and the mission and all of the work and dedication of so many smart people, because it erases everything that we do. And so it just seems to me that at best, we are either, either unaware, or there is some kind of level of responsibility, of intentionality to hoard this power in order to not make those two basic changes at so many levels. For me, the issue of participation at the end of the day is who decides? Who decides? Every time you're stuck in any situation, just ask yourself, who is making the decision at the end of the day? And, philanthropic institutions are modernist in style. They are patriarchal. They are all about the leaders. The governance systems are self-generating. There's no way for anyone to really get in there and make decisions. And so, yet, we moan and groan about not having authentic relationships with the people we work with. But they're smart. They understand that we're not being genuine and authentic and transparent in building a relationship with them. So they're going to have a transactional relationship with us. It's just very simple. And I don't think, we've reached a point where this farce is just too grave to continue to, to fuel and to generate. The issue of, just to end on this, on issues of participatory methods, participatory models are not new. We've got incredible experiences with participatory budgeting, participatory governance at all levels. And participatory philanthropy is just one other component. It is not a revolution. It's literally an issue of governance. It is literally the missing link between wealth and democracy. It is literally this missing link that has been missing all along. Because at the end of the day, if you don't create a governance structures for decision-making to happen at the resource level, then you're just coming up with excuses all the time. And we don't have time for excuses at this level. So, I think that I'll end with a quote from Foucault. You can't talk about power without mentioning Foucault. I know it sounds snotty, but here it goes. Modern bureaucratic institutions exude rationality, scientific expertise, and humane concerns, but really they amount to an arbitrary form of exercise of power that has been normalized. And it's kind of like oh my God, this is exactly what we're experiencing right now. So I think it's really important to just realize that we can no longer make those big claims. We look ridiculous within institutional philanthropy, making change about changing the world, and we funded something for 3 years and we've shifted it completely, and and every time someone new comes along, they have to come up with their great idea. I think we need to calm down, and we need to figure out how to render our institutions more transparent and open, and to let go of some of the wealth that we have by placing it in secure spaces outside of the realms of our fortresses, so that communities, citizens decide. Making decisions about resources is an issue of governance. Raymond Joris, who some of you might know, was right. He's kind of the teddy bear of European philanthropy. Was writing a letter in support of RAWA, and he said, referendum non, RAWA oui. And what he was saying is that basically, the participatory models are the missing link between to save democratic institutions and our democratic practice moving forward.
Thank you. Muted itself. Just kind of bouncing off that a bit, I'm just going to bounce a few questions around so we can hear from different people before we open to the questions. I mean, both Vidya and Ambika, you spoke about, in a way, the decentralization we can see in many ways, right? And one of the decentralizations is actually decentralizing the idea that all philanthropy comes from the global north and sort of extends out into our regions. And what you are doing is building up philanthropy where you are. And so that's kind of one of actually the power shifts, right, that's happening in philanthropy, that even the location of the giving is different. And as Ambika, you spoke to quite eloquently, it does change the perspective of what's given. Vidya, you're also mentioning that I mean, if you're of the place, obviously you have a slightly different vantage point, and also tend to really be in it for the long haul, because basically you can't leave. I mean, it's your home. So I'm interested to hear from you two about this issue of what it actually means to give to social change in your environments. Because as we well know, in the places where we come from, there are long traditions of philanthropic giving, but they're often for charitable or basic needs, right? People are very generous, but it tends to be for sort of basic needs, but you're investing in work that's about rights and challenging power in the environments. So I'm interested to hear from both of you about this question of what it means to be practicing philanthropy in your own locations, and what some of the possibilities and challenges are in doing that. So maybe Vidya first and then Ambika.
Thanks, Jessica. I think, as I was speaking about the evolution of, let's call it homegrown philanthropy, I just realized that the practice of philanthropy is, in the way we know it now, as an organized, planned, focused activity, is relatively new. But the strength of civil society has existed for far longer. We've had a very large, very vibrant, somewhat chaotic civil society out here, very vocal, very activist. So I think, therefore, the power structure at one point was unequal in favor of civil society. But as personal philanthropy and as CSR has grown, that power structure has begun to change. And partly it's because when you see personal philanthropy, and if you, we work with an organization called Hurun and come out with a philanthropy list every year. The largest funder, which is the promoter of a large tech company, gave away about $1 billion last year. Now, with that kind of giving, and if you look at the top 10 people, they've given it the order of magnitude, a couple of $100 million through to $1 billion. I think their expectations of what the money will do, is very different from foundations like ours who, work very differently with our grantees. When it's large philanthropy, unfortunately, you also see, a tendency to demand large impact. And it could be a time horizon of 5 to 7 years, but we all know that that is not long-term anymore in development. You need to have an even longer time horizon. And therefore, when it's big money, you expect big impact in a reasonable time frame. And there's a lot of work then it demands working with the system. It demands working with the government. It demands working with looking at things in a systemic way. And that causes its own, that has its own consequences. So there's a tendency in India that the larger the philanthropy is, the more into self-implementing mode that philanthropists go. They become operating foundations, which is very tricky because unless you come from a mindset that I really don't know anything and I cannot completely apply business principles to my philanthropy and expect, that kind of arithmetic almost outcome creation, it starts becoming very difficult for civil society organizations who've done incredible work over time, but have not been able to adjust to this new normal. And so one of the complaints I've heard from from civil society is that, we start getting treated as vendors, as a provider of service, as opposed to somebody who really understands issues of social development on the ground. So I think this is the dynamic that one is seeing, and the same thing is happening with CSRs as well. And therefore, when I spoke about this confusion, it's because civil society organizations are struggling to find an identity that they can claim with a lot of conviction and pride. Because are you a vendor? Or are you somebody who's going to support a very large organization in implementing multi-state, programs? That is the kind of confusion that's there. So therefore, the place that we're trying to find is one of dialogue and of trying to bring people together to first listen rather than to immediately prescribe. And that is a very interesting process because unfortunately, civil society is not used to it. The evolution of international aid also meant a highly application-based, project-oriented approach to things. There was freedom, but there was a framework. Those frameworks have disappeared. The players are new. And therefore, there is this churn that I see in the thinking. And for me, the only way is to encourage a lot more dialogue, to have a lot of healthy respect for each other, and to figure out a way of working, in this new normal sort of situation.
I think in Sri Lanka, I wouldn't actually say that we have a thriving philanthropy. What we have is, I think, charity. People still haven't gotten around to understanding what philanthropy is. So in a sense, the trust still is kind of an intermediary. We're caught in the middle. So for us, sharing power or power relations and striking the right balance means not only sharing power with our partners, but also our relationship with those who are supporting us, who are giving us the funds. So for instance, it's sometimes just turning down money and saying, sorry, we can't because we cannot support this, the kind of work you want. Or for saying that, we don't agree with you interfering or making decisions for us, or we will not support only the groups that you want us to support, various things. So I think it is quite complex, and particularly in Sri Lanka, we've had an ethnic conflict for 30 years, repressive regimes. We find there is a lot of reluctance to support anything viewed as controversial internally in the country. So for instance, if we're talking about human rights, you're talking about arbitrary detention, supporting, survivors of torture, well, yeah, you're not going to find any takers. Education, building wells, building houses, then of course, yes. So for us, I think even within the community, because I think with the communities we serve, yes, they trust us. Over 20 years, we somehow managed to build a relationship of trust. But then how does the state view us? Or how do the others, the larger community, majority community, how do they view us? So I think power is quite a complex thing for us. And also, if we look at development aid in Sri Lanka, that's been quite an unequal relationship, because what it has done also, it has been, there's been positive impact as well, because of development aid, organizations have been able to work on human rights issues, issues thought to be politically controversial. But at the same time, it's also eroded civil society. What we have now, in a way, are NGOs. There are professionals. So in a sense, we don't have social movements. So when you have repressive regimes, what you need to challenge that, repressive power are social movements. But we do not have that, and it's a challenge to build that. So I think for NTT, we're kind of, in a complex environment, trying to, we are very sure of the values, our values, and what we want to support, how we want to support, that we're sure of. But sometimes I think our strategies, we have to change according to the evolving context in the country.
Both in the sense of the legacy of the old, because the old is still hanging around, right? The legacy of the old and what it's meant in terms of how people are thinking about the work they're doing. So still this obsession with projects and what have you, but also the time that it takes to build something new. So whether it's a new philanthropic community or the trust in community to actually get this work done. So it's very interesting as we're talking about this to think about the question of time and actually have some patience, perhaps, with ourselves as we grapple with this shifting power. Henry, I'm interested in, with all of this, in questions of scale, because very often when we talk about participation and decentralized models, a lot of the examples that are given are relatively small in scale. And institutional philanthropy, particularly the larger foundations, tend to be interested in investing at scale. Something like Giving Tuesday has actually managed to shift things at tremendous scale. So I'm just keen to hear from you about sort of what some of the insights are about that and about the potential for the sort of different way of working with power and philanthropy at scale.
Well, I think Mukhtar touched on it earlier, which is we need to see investment at scale. Right, one of the dangers, even with this participatory work now, it's actually very minor investments, largely in terms of what's actually going on in the world, and that makes it hard, I think, for people to try new things. Also, I think there's a danger, which is a lot of this work is experimental because it is new. People are trying new things. We're making our missteps as a community. We're learning things. We're getting things right. We're getting things wrong, and the comparison of that to some tried and tested grantees who have been funded happily for years is quite hard for foundations in particular to get their heads off. So I think the foundation world needs to make bigger bets on participation, no question. I think that helps us a lot. I also think we can't deny that the larger governance and kind of capital superstructures are restraining these kinds of models, right? There are lots of challenging governance questions about running distributed models and decentralized models, and they aren't straightforward, and about ownership and liability and all things which matter enormously, but that's all territory that's being worked out now. So I think some further work, and again, I think this is exactly why communities like this one can be so meaningful, because I do think there's a big set of issues around governance and new power movements that need to be worked on. There's a big set of issues around how funding can be applied at vastly greater scale, much bigger bets on participatory work. So I think that's a general frame, and I'd offer kind of two thoughts. One thought, I thought Ambika touched on a really important point, which we should all recognize too, which is there's a nuance to this, right? In the sense that we are not saying that this is the end of institutions and everything is going to be a distributed, decentralized paradise where everything is free form and there are no leaders, right? We are suggesting that one of the ways of thinking about social change is the interplay between movements and institutions, right? What they can learn from each other, how they can feed each other, how they can support each other. And all of us have to get good at the strength of old power institutions and the energy of new power movements and how we start to bring those together. I think that is part of the key to scale in terms of how we get to that in general. And then lastly, I think there's a generosity in learning, right? I think one of the dangers of this work is that it becomes small scale, that we have things that we're very proud of, but actually are, a cooperative of 35 brewers in Belgium who have worked out some way of crowdsourcing their equity, right? And like that, it's compelling, but it's not going to be impactful. So I think one of the really important things, which is if we're going to build these kinds of new power movements, we have to build like learning ecosystems where we are all informing each other and learning from each other and building on each other. And again, I think the manifesto for Wings for the next 20 years, thinking about Wings, not in an old power way as an annual conference where everyone gets together and they hear the keynote speeches and they listen and they learn and they go back to their homes, but an ongoing, a live community of people who are sharing best practice, supporting each other as allies and shifting outcomes in the direction of progress. That feels to me like a good manifesto for Wings.
About us doing this work, and we're in the midst of it, but also sharing ideas and kind of co-inspiring to think about what to do. In the spirit of participation, I actually want to turn over quickly to some questions because we have a bit of time for that. And Henry, you're talking about the question of governance, and there is a question here from John Edwards, which is about the issue of how local agencies who receive foreign funding are often labeled as sort of foreign agents, or there's a sort of politicization of the receipt of funds. And we've seen that in many countries, of course, what we often dub closing space and how it affects philanthropy. So what can we do about that? And how can we kind of intervene to sort of support that? The question is, how can systems be changed without engaging in political? I don't know who would like to answer that question. Maybe Ambika and Mukhtar, because I think, yeah, go ahead.
It's a difficult question, and I don't think there are any kind of easy or correct answers, because, and it comes back, I think, to also public perceptions, because in Sri Lanka, the public perception now of these what are called NGOs is that we are foreign agents, that you're undermining national sovereignty, and you're part of some great global conspiracy. So how do you change that? In order to change that, you need to increase public awareness. But then when you don't have social movements and people working at the community level, particularly within communities where this kind of notion is very prevalent. So for instance, here, if all the donors go to the north and the east of our country, which is conflict affected, and preach to the converted, really doesn't help. You need to be doing your work in the south, where the majority community thinks this, and where there are media organizations affiliated with the state who keep fueling this. So I think it is a tough one. And I think, as someone mentioned it earlier, courage. I think for organizations like ours, that needs to be the core of our being, courage to keep soldiering on, and then to try to support initiatives that do this work, creating public awareness, and also do work with the communities working on things like socioeconomic rights, enhancing livelihoods, where people can see change in their lives and they understand these terms that we use: social justice, social change. What does it mean? Or it means that I can actually hold my local public official accountable, that I can get water, a pump connected to my house so I can engage in agriculture. So where they make those connections, and they see civil society organizations helping them bring about that change and helping them make those connections. It is not easy, it's difficult, and there might be casualties along the way, because the way that our states are acting, I think that's kind of inevitable. So therefore, I think courage is what we need to, go forward.
Jessica, if I may add a few points on this issue, I think that if first of all, I think that at the grassroots level, regardless of whether in the South or North, because civic space is shutting down everywhere. I think groups need to limit their exposure to international donors or donors that don't come from their communities. So, for instance, at RAWA, we've put a percentage of our annual budget that comes from a single donor. We've also done that for individual donations as well, to kind of mitigate the risk. And also, if some new creative genius comes along at the foundation that's been supporting us and then decides to pull the funding or do something else, then then you're not really stuck. But I think there's also issues of ethical practice within the philanthropic sector that we need to also really embody. And it's almost seems, I don't want to be patronizing, but it's almost like everyone who joins a foundation needs to kind of go through an ethical kind of, political philosophy course or some kind of training. So many emerging groups are just beginning to get their act together, and then funders are like, oh, new idea, let's give them $500,000, and then boom, of course they're not going to say no, and then they drown, and then their community is like, what's going on? So I mean, there are certain things that to do, and there are things that you just don't do. On another hand, imagine if with over a period of, say 5 years that a foundation is supporting a community group, imagine if half of that money, or imagine if they can accompany that grant with program-related investments that allows them to create, pooled resources at the grassroots level, to create income-generating activities so that they can invest, to develop a community philanthropy dimension to the work that they're doing. All of these things will help them kind of become more independent and secure within their own community in practice. There's so much that we have within the philanthropic sector in terms of tools. At some point, you were going to ask us about tools and ideas for moving forward, but pool resources, allow your grantees to develop reserves, create community philanthropy opportunities for grantees, in program-related investments, which are basically loans at very, very reduced amounts of money that we can do. To begin with, also increase your donation rates, your giving rates within the philanthropic sector. That's also something that would be helpful, at least to build infrastructure of resilience at the community level.
Here about what can be done. So thank you for that. Just a question to Henry, who actually needs to leave. And so I just wanted to ask him this from Patricia Curran, particularly given your work with Giving Tuesday and its global nature. Do we outsiders have a role in encouraging homegrown philanthropy? Do we even have any business advocating for that? Are there resources out there that we can invest in so that community leaders, our partners, grantees, urge a shift from charity to local resources, deconstructing systems that perpetuate injustice?
Yes, I think that is the right answer. I mean, I think as to the question, the good framing earlier was like, who's making the decisions, right? But I also think part of it is who's powerful. So one thing which I think has been inspiring about Giving Tuesday is there's no kind of overarching hierarchy to it, right? The leaders in each country are the leaders of Giving Tuesday, and they are co-owners. They own it as much as anybody else, and there's no kind of centralized infrastructure which is belonging to one person. So that I think that is the right metaphor, which is how do we not just distribute the participation but distribute the power so people are equally powerful. And I think that is challenging. Like I think the other thing about this is it's kind of an easy thing to attack right now, but if you've been working in a foundation for 30 years and you've had all of this power and you've reviewed these grant applications and you've been the person who says on a quarterly basis who gets the money and who doesn't, and suddenly you're being told, no, that whole set of skills is pointless. What you need to be good at is catalyzing grassroots agency of experimental collaborative movements. Like that is just not what you're good at, right? That is a completely different world. So I do think part of the effort here is actually, and I like the idea of kind of education for foundations and others, which is actually, it's a very different set of skill sets to support and encourage this work, both for the funders and the practitioners, right? On both sides of that equation, I think the hope I would have is that we A, work out better ways of structuring this work, which is more effective, but B, we also get to a leadership style, which is actually more scalable, right? Because one of the dangers of many of the leadership styles we have is they're not scalable because they're limited by the agency of the leader. And so if we can create, you know, there's that amazing, the phrase that Black Lives Matter founders use, which is that idea of leaderful movements, that actually what you end up creating is something that creates and multiplies leadership across a sector or an issue. That seems to me a very good goal.
Absolutely, and that idea about the fact that actually you can't just change like that, you need actually skills to do so. So that's a very important point about what skills do we actually need to be building, what new knowledges do we need to be building if we're going to be doing this well. And thank you, Henry. I know you need to go, so it's been an absolute pleasure to be with you in this community. So Vidya, there's a question from an anonymous question, but that speaks to the philanthropic sector in India. So the question is that they feel that there's a massive gap between the middle class and the whole idea of philanthropy. And so they say, I believe the system has failed to bridge the gap, and maybe that's the reason why Indians are not very aware and concerned with these issues. What do you think of this? Do you think this can be bridged with the help of mass media? So to engage not just the wealthy, but also the Indian middle class in terms of becoming a philanthropic force?
Actually, it's been an interesting trend, particularly since COVID, where there have been numerous articles that I've personally read where the amount of personal, what we call retail giving, has skyrocketed in this period of COVID. And I think there's been a concerted effort over the last few years, including efforts like Giving Tuesday. It's highly popular in India, especially around October, November, when we have the festival of Diwali. And to use that as not an excuse, but as a sort of a way of exhorting people to give. And so I think there's a lot of change that has happened. There's some interesting incentives, that have been created around giving, especially at the retail level. I'm seeing a significant change, since I started 12, 13 years ago, when retail giving was hardly existed. And from what I know, in the period of 6 months, the amount of retail giving that has gotten raised is a huge multiple of the annual give that we've seen. Like, we have an organization in India called Give India, and it's the largest retail platform. And in addition, we are seeing a lot of fundraising through crowdsourcing platforms, and there are many of them of all kinds, from charity to a more sort of loan kind of loan-based giving. So I'm very, very hopeful, actually, as we're seeing increasing wealth at all levels and an increasing middle class. I actually don't believe that there is apathy around issues.
Okay, and interesting again that sometimes it's a question of vantage point, but yeah, emergencies always bring out the generosity in people, and sometimes it's a question of how do we then build on that to really encourage that to continue, and where people see the validity of what their giving does to support, as I said, to maintain each other's lives. Beautiful. Okay, well, we're going to wrap up, and so I just wanted in closing to sort of ask you that question, which I'll ask you. Which is really, in social change work, it's funny, somebody actually mentioned it in one of the questions. In social change work, we always say that our work is to actually work ourselves out of a job. That actually we need to be efficient enough in our practice of justice that we're actually able to create a world that doesn't need us to be coming in to repair and to defend and to, you know, to advocate and to stand up when everything is going wrong. So in closing, I'm curious to hear from each of you about sort of the 2 key things that you feel philanthropy can do to help us towards that goal of sort of redistributing power in society and sustaining justice and inclusion for the majority. So I'll start with Mokhtar.
You always start with me, it's not fair. Okay, great. And of course, I was prepared for your question, but so I mean, I don't want us to sound yes, you know, I'm very passionate about this because the issues are urgent and the issues are frustrating, but I'm also very hopeful, as others have mentioned, that there are movements all around the world that are really organizing themselves in a very different, unusual, and productive manner, and are also bringing a holistic notion, not a kind of this detached notion of resource mobilization and resource giving. And you know, people are realizing that social capital is real, that human capital is real, that community capital is real, and that people are, you know, coming together to reorganize themselves. And you say the word reorganize because societies were always had a form of organization to watch each other's back in all traditional societies, and in a way that we've lost those for a variety of reasons that we've mentioned. But you know, I'm excited about the ideas, the notions of outsourcing at least, you know, part of budgets to decision-making power, regardless of the spectrum of decision-making process, to communities outside of philanthropy. Let's maybe set a goal, 10% in the next 10 years. You know, that would be a great milestone to accomplish. I'm really interested in how some philanthropies are struggling with hierarchies and are thinking more in terms of teams of folks to kind of break the kind of hegemony of the program officer dynamic. I'm interested in the notion of pooled resources by different groups, including communities, in addition to philanthropies, to solve a problem at a local level. I think we should abolish discretionary funds. Those make absolutely no sense and are anti-democratic in nature, and again, something that I'm seeing more and more foundations adopt, and to democratize access to reserve funds, because reserve funds, basically, if you've got someone's ear, you have access to reserve funds. I value very much this opportunity of self-criticism and debate and honest conversation about how do we organize ourselves. You know, self-love, it's not hard criticism, it's more about love and equity and solidarity and being more efficient together. I think that we need to really centralize notions of intersectional feminism at all levels, all over the place, all the time. Try it, you'll like it. I do think that we just need to get political, and that our problems are not technical, they are political in nature, and we can support movements and organizing in the coming years to really take on those challenges moving forward.
I'll be very brief, Jessica. I think, you know, given the scale of problems in India, I think philanthropy can best really support development through 2 things. I think looking at issues at the system level and really trying to help government implement or provide services better, and particularly through the areas of public policy, and strengthening existing and building new institutions. I think that is really, really very, very important in India right now.
I think for social change and to achieve social justice, we need to invest in social protection systems. For this, we need to change the way people engage with authority and the way they engage with the state, because it is about holding power structures accountable if we want to work ourselves out of a job. So I think we need to help build social movements, which means we have to change the way we make grants, our systems, and our processes. And I think in Sri Lanka, the positive outcome of COVID and increased militarization and creeping authoritarianism is that it has brought the spirit of volunteerism and holding the state accountable to the fore. But it is happening in two different spheres. We have the social media and at the community level within communities. So our challenge is how do we connect the two to harness their collective power? But it is in a way showing us new ways to build communities and to harness this new power positively. Thank you.
And to to all four of you on the panel for a really brilliant set of thoughts that are both visionary in their scope, but actually really practical. This is something that we are doing already, a lot that we are learning about. And what's also beautiful, it seems, is that it works, right? Which philanthropy is always concerned about doing things that work. So a lot of this is actually succeeding in already even shifting power in different ways. So a very big thanks to all of you for your generosity of time and spirit. Thank you to all of the people who are listening to us, who are asking questions, engaging on Twitter. And thank you to Wings also for opening the space for such an important conversation at this point in your history. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Benjamin BELLEGY to give his final remarks. Thank you to everyone.
And thank you, Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks to all the panelists. Well, that was really incredible. I think there were so many excellent, thought-provoking ideas and insights, so much to think about. So actually, I really want to take these last few minutes to thank, of course, all the outstanding panel presenters, the WINGSForum 2021 partner, the Ford Foundation, and our supporters, our other partners. We have also been supported a lot by the WINGSForum planning and host committees and our co-host, the Africa Philanthropy Network. Obviously, I want to thank the WINGS team who did a fantastic job in very challenging circumstances, and all the WINGS members who make us who we are. And all of you, of course, for joining us today from all over the world. I just want to mention a few very quick things before we close the call. The first thing is that for WINGS members, I really strongly encourage you to join our exclusive members workshops, during which we will deepen this conversation that we've had today. We'll have small groups and we'll try to sort of maintain that conversation, go deeper in the reflections together over the coming weeks. And actually the conversation is just starting today. We really want to culminate in Nairobi next year. Then I also want to invite all of you to join us again in February and in April, when we will have our 2 other plenary sessions, and they will also be open to all. So please be with us. It's going to be also extremely interesting. And lastly, I promised you earlier an exclusive preview on our new brand. So it is something that we've been working on for a while and which we're very excited about, because as the times have changed, so have we. We've expanded the vision, we've expanded the look, both to reflect the changing times. So be prepared, this is coming. So welcome to our new identity. You've seen that logo already at the end of the film. We'll be unveiling this next week, early next week, together with the brand new website. And actually the website will also have great new interactive features for all the members to actually connect to each other. So that's responding a little bit to the call from Henry Teams, which I thought was extremely relevant. And we're very much in line with that. Like, how do we transform a network like Wings into really a movement where people to people can connect, can learn, and where really the power is distributed. I think it has always been. It's really in our DNA as a network. But we're now going to have new tools to go even beyond in this new power approach in building a strong, resilient, diverse, inclusive global philanthropy ecosystem. So thank you once again for joining us, and let's continue the conversation on Twitter, and we hope to see you again very soon at the workshops for members and at the other future plenaries in February and April. Thank you so much.